Imagine London in flames, your family in a bunker, and your own king is the one who gave Hitler the coordinates. The narrative arc of British history throughout the 20th century is often portrayed through a prism of unwavering duty, the steadfastness of the Blitz, and the eventual transition from a global empire to a respected commonwealth, all anchored by the serene and stoic figure of Queen Elizabeth II. For 7 decades, she served as the ultimate symbol of British resilience, a woman whose entire existence was defined by a profound and unshakable commitment to the crown and the constitutional stability of her nation. When she passed, the world mourned the end of an era, celebrating a life of service that seemed to define the very concept of monarchy in the modern age. However, beneath this meticulously polished and carefully curated exterior lies a fractured, darker legacy of the House of Windsor, a legacy that nearly toppled the British Empire from within during its most vulnerable and desperate hour. This was not merely a family squabble or a polite disagreement over royal protocol. It was a crisis of existential proportions that threatened the very foundations of the state and the democratic principles it stood for. History, as told in popular textbooks and romanticized documentaries, has often deliberately buried or softened a terrifying truth about her own uncle, King Edward VIII, for decades, presenting his departure as a tragic, selfless sacrifice for love. But the reality is far more Machiavellian, bordering on the outright treasonous. What if the King of England was just a romantic who gave up the throne for the woman he loved, but a committed Nazi sympathizer who was actively plotting to reclaim his crown over the smoldering ruins of a bombed and defeated London? For years, the narrative of the 1936 abdication crisis dominated the public consciousness, a story of a modern, forward-thinking king choosing personal happiness over the cold, lonely isolation of absolute power. But the reality is a chilling tale of high-stakes espionage and ideological betrayal. This is the secret the royal family tried to burn, a cache of documents so explosive they threatened to delegitimize the monarchy itself and potentially change the entire course of the Second World War. The ashes of this treason remain in the historical record, whispering of a king who was willing to see his own people suffer under a fascist boot, if it meant his return to the throne. To truly understand the reign of Elizabeth II, one must first understand the long, dark shadow cast by the man who almost destroyed everything she spent 70 years trying to protect. In the immediate aftermath of the Great War, a conflict that had shattered old empires and left a generation scarred and disillusioned, the world was hungry for a new kind of leader, someone who represented the vibrant future rather than the rigid Victorian past. Prince Edward, the Prince of Wales, seemed to be the perfect embodiment of this new, modern age. Known to his family and close friends as David, he was the most famous celebrity in the entire world, a charismatic golden boy whose every movement was chronicled by the burgeoning mass media of the 1920s. He charmed the masses with his modern style, his affinity for American jazz, his casual approach to dress, and his apparent deep empathy for the working class. During his high-profile tours of the impoverished mining districts of Wales and the industrial heartlands of the North, he famously declared that something must be done for the unemployed, a statement that endeared him to the public but rankled the government. To the average citizen, he was the breath of fresh air that the stuffy, tradition-bound monarchy desperately needed to remain relevant in a rapidly changing democratic era. He was the people's prince, a fashion icon who popularized the Windsor knot and the +4s, and a global traveler who seemed at home in every corner of the empire. However, behind the practiced, dazzling smile and the dashing public appearances, there lay a deep and simmering disdain for British democracy and the parliamentary system. Edward viewed the slow, deliberative, and often messy processes of Parliament as archaic, inefficient, and fundamentally broken in the face of modern challenges. he found himself increasingly drawn to the efficiency and vitality of rising dictatorships in Europe, marveling at how figures like Benito Mussolini seemed to command their nations with a singular, decisive will that bypassed the need for consensus. This wasn't just a youthful rebellion against his stern and distant father, King George V. It was a fundamental ideological shift toward authoritarianism. While his father worried incessantly about the survival of the dynasty in a world turned upside down by the Russian Revolution, Edward was secretly setting the stage for an ideological clash. His private leanings began to drift dangerously toward the fascist movements that promised order through absolute control and the suppression of the very democratic dissent that Edward found so tiresome. He believed that the king should not just be a figurehead, but a leader with the power to act, a conviction that put him on a direct and inevitable collision course with the constitutional limits of the British throne. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help US keep these legends alive. As the 1930s progressed and the shadows of totalitarianism lengthened over the European continent, the prince's personal life became the catalyst for a constitutional wildfire that would nearly consume the monarchy. Edward fell under the total and hypnotic spell of Wallace Simpson, a sharp-witted American socialite with a questionable past and a penchant for the high-octane, decadent life of the European aristocracy. Their affair was scandalous not just because she was a twice-divorced woman, having been married to Winfield Spencer and later Ernest Simpson, a fact that rendered her completely unacceptable as a future queen consort in the eyes of the Church of England and the British establishment. The real danger lay in the deeply suspicious company she kept and the influence she exerted over the heir to the throne. Intelligence reports from MI5 and the FBI began to circulate through the highest levels of the British government with increasing frequency, and the details they contained were nothing short of chilling. These dossiers, often referred to as the China dossier or the Simpson file, focused not just on her morality or her perceived dominance over the future king, but on her dangerous social circles, which included suspected intimate and political links to the German ambassador in London, Joachim von Ribbentrop. The British intelligence community feared that Simpson was far more than just an ambitious social climber. They suspected she was a conduit for sensitive information, a potential honey trap or influence agent for German interests. There were whispers in the corridors of power that von Ribbentrop sent her 17 carnations every single day, one for every time they had supposedly been together in the bedroom. While some of these rumors may have been exaggerated by those who sought to remove her, the underlying concern was real. These reports raised massive alarm bells in the halls of Surmise and MI5, painting a picture of a future king who was hopelessly compromised by a woman who might be a direct, unfiltered line to the heart of the Nazi diplomatic and intelligence machine. The fear among the men in gray suits was that the most guarded secrets of the British Empire were being whispered in the dark to a woman whose primary loyalty was not to the crown, but to her own influence and her high-ranking German connections. The tension reached a catastrophic breaking point in January 1936 when King George V died, and Edward ascended the throne as Edward VIII. Almost immediately, the transition of power revealed a terrifying level of negligence and a total disregard for the sanctity of the royal office. Edward routinely ignored the state papers in the red boxes, the critical daily briefings from the government that contained top-secret intelligence, diplomatic cables, and legislative proposals requiring the monarch's signature and immediate attention. Instead of treating these sensitive documents with the required confidentiality, he often left them scattered around his private residences, such as Fort Belvedere, where they were easily accessible to his guests including Wallace Simpson and her circle of pro-German friends. There were reports of documents being returned to the government with wine stains on them, or worse, evidence that they had been read by unauthorized eyes. He openly mocked the government and the ancient traditions of the British state, treating his royal duties with a level of flippancy that bordered on the treasonous. He would disappear for weekends with Mrs. Simpson, leaving the government unable to contact the head of state during international crises. His erratic behavior, characterized by late-night parties, heavy drinking, and a total lack of discretion in his conversations, made his loose lips regarding state secrets a matter of urgent and terrifying national security. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and his cabinet, along with the heads of the intelligence services, began to view the new king not just as a nuisance or a playboy monarch who refused to grow up, but as a genuine threat to the safety and stability of the realm. They realized that the man wearing the crown had no respect for the constitutional boundaries that kept the monarchy in place, and worse, he seemed to have a total disregard for the secrecy required to protect the empire's interests. During a time when Adolf Hitler was already remilitarizing the Rhineland and preparing the German war machine for a conflict that many saw as inevitable, the king was, in the eyes of his own government, a massive security leak sitting directly on the throne, potentially feeding information to the very power that was preparing to destroy British democracy. By the end of 1936, the king's matter could no longer be contained within the private circles of the court or the polite whispers of the establishment, and the government presented the abdication crisis to the public primarily as a moral and religious issue regarding Wallace Simpson's impending second divorce. This was the narrative carefully and strategically fed to the newspapers, and the public a romantic tragedy about a modern, loving king who was being forced to choose between his heart and his crown because of the Church of England's strict, unyielding rules on marriage and divorce. However, in the shadows of surmise and the corridors of the Foreign Office, the true relief among British officials was the removal of a monarch who they feared was politically unstable, mentally erratic, and far too friendly with the fascists rising in Berlin. The religious and social objections were in many ways a convenient and highly effective smokescreen, a legalistic and moral way to prune a dangerous and diseased branch from the royal tree, without having to admit to the British public that their king was a potential fifth columnist. Behind the closed doors of 10 Downing Street, the discussions weren't centered on marriage certificates, religious dogma, or the Archbishop of Canterbury's disapproval. They were about the survival of the British state and the growing, evidence-based fear that Edward, if left on the throne, would eventually attempt to bypass Parliament to forge a direct and disastrous alliance with Adolf Hitler. Such a move would have effectively ended British democracy as it was known, and placed the United Kingdom in the orbit of the Third Reich as a junior partner or a vassal state. The abdication was, in reality, a quiet, bloodless, and remarkably efficient coup by the establishment to save the country from a king who no longer shared its values or its strategic interests. The government also had to contend with the King's Party, a group of influential figures like Lord Beaverbrook and Winston Churchill who initially supported Edward, making the political maneuvering even more delicate. Baldwin had to navigate the opinions of the dominions, from Canada to Australia, ensuring that the entire empire stood united in its refusal to accept Wallis as queen, thereby boxing the king into a corner from which the only escape was resignation. The crisis culminated on a rainy, somber night in December 1936, when Edward delivers his famous radio address to the nation and the vast reaches of the British Empire, painting himself as a victim of archaic rules and an unfeeling, rigid establishment. His voice, tinged with a practiced and theatrical melancholy, won the hearts of the romantic and unsuspecting public as he declared he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility of kingship without the woman he loved by his side. It was a masterclass in public relations and emotional manipulation that cast him as a tragic, modern hero rather than a failed and dangerous leader who had neglected his duties. The broadcast was heard by millions, many of whom wept at the thought of their charismatic king being forced out. He steps down, becoming the Duke of Windsor, but he leaves the country with a bitter, simmering, and deeply personal grudge against his younger brother, the shy, stuttering, and deeply reluctant new King George VI, and the entire British establishment that he felt had exiled and humiliated him on the world stage. This bitterness was a poisonous seed that would grow in the years to come, fueled by Wallis' own resentment at being denied the status she craved. Edward did not go quietly into a private life of quiet leisure as many in the government had hoped. He left with a burning sense of entitlement and a deep-seated resentment toward the family. and the country that he felt had rejected his modern and enlightened vision. He saw himself not as a man who had failed his ultimate, sacred duty to the people, but as a sovereign who had been robbed of his divine birthright by small-minded, gray-suited bureaucrats. The night he left Fort Belvedere, his brother Bertie, the new king, was reportedly so overwhelmed by the weight of the crown and the betrayal of his brother that he broke down in tears. This mindset of victimhood made Edward incredibly vulnerable to the flattery and machinations of Britain's most dangerous enemies, who were watching the chaos in London with great interest and planning how to exploit the former king's wounded ego. Following the abdication, the newly created Duke and Duchess of Windsor moved to France, but the transition was far from the peaceful domestic bliss and quiet retirement the Duke had promised in his emotional radio address. Isolated in a foreign land and stripped of his royal allowance by a vengeful and worried Buckingham Palace, the bitter Duke becomes an easy target for Nazi flattery and recruitment efforts. He felt humiliated by the refusal of the British government to grant Wallis the title of Her Royal Highness, a slight that he took more personally than the loss of the throne itself. Spending hours writing letters to his brother demanding the title be granted, the couple's life in exile was marked by constant, petty financial disputes with the palace and a desperate, almost obsessive attempt to maintain the lavish lifestyle of reigning monarchs without the income or the official status to support it. They moved into a grand house in Paris and spent time at the Schloss Enzisfeld in Austria, surrounding themselves with a court of sycophants and pro-fascist aristocrats, German agents, sensing a golden opportunity to further destabilize Britain and potentially place a friendly, puppet-like face back on the throne in the future, began to aggressively cultivate a relationship with the Windsors. They treated the couple with the royal deference, the bows, the curtsies, and the formal protocol they so desperately craved, validating Edward's core belief that he was a wronged man, and that Nazi Germany was the only power on earth that truly respected him and recognized his wife's rightful status. The Nazi leadership, particularly von Ribbentrop, who was now the German foreign minister, and Joseph Goebbels, saw Edward as a displaced person of immense symbolic and strategic value. They didn't just want him as a high society friend to attend parties with. They wanted him as a political weapon to be deployed against the very government that had forced him out. They knew that a former king in their pocket was worth more than a dozen divisions on the battlefield when it came to psychological warfare. The relationship between the Windsors and the Nazi regime took a brazenly public and highly dangerous turn in 1937, just a year after the abdication. Defying the British government's explicit, stern advice and the frantic, back-channel warnings of the Foreign Office, Edward and Wallis visit Nazi Germany as if they were still visiting heads of state. This was no private vacation, no simple curiosity tour. It was a high-profile, carefully choreographed propaganda tour designed by the Nazi regime to show the world that the former British king was an admirer of their new order and their socialist achievements. During the trip, they were given the full state treatment, staying in the finest luxury hotels and traveling across the country in Hitler's own personal, armor-plated train. They are photographed inspecting SS guards, dining with high-ranking officials like Rudolf Hess and the Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring, and being shown model factories and labor camps that had been scrubbed clean and staged for their arrival. They visited the Ordensburg schools, where the future Nazi elite were being trained in racial ideology and physical combat. Edward was deeply and visibly impressed by the industrial might, the disciplined youth movements, and the rigid social order of the Third Reich, viewing it as the efficiency he had always wanted to implement in Britain. For Edward, these meticulously staged displays of German strength were a testament to the success of a system he had always admired from afar. It was a PR disaster of the highest order for Great Britain, signaling to the world that the former king was completely out of sync with his own country's increasingly anti-fascist foreign policy. While the British public was beginning to wake up to the horrific reality of Nazism, their former king was smiling, shaking hands, and effectively providing a veneer of royal legitimacy to a regime that was already planning the systematic destruction of European peace and the industrial scale enslavement of nations. The absolute climax of this ill-fated and treacherous tour occurred When the couple traveled to Berchtesgaden to meet Adolf Hitler personally at his mountain retreat, the Berghof, in a moment that would haunt the royal family for generations and serve as the most damning evidence of his ultimate betrayal. The former King of England is seen giving the Nazi salute to the Führer. The meeting was far more than a mere formality or a social visit between aristocrats. It was an ideological meeting of minds. They sat for tea in Hitler's grand reception room, looking out over the Bavarian Alps. Reports from those present, and later captured documents, suggest they spent hours discussing the future of Europe and how Germany and Britain could and should rule the world together as partners. Edward reportedly told Hitler that the British people were not the ones who wanted a war with Germany, but rather the Jewish-controlled press and a cabal of warmongering politicians in London who were leading the nation astray. This was more than just a lapse in judgment or an attempt at amateur diplomacy. It was a full-throated ideological embrace of the Nazi worldview. Hitler was reportedly very impressed with Wallis, later telling his inner circle that she would have made a good queen by standing next to the Führer and adopting the symbols of his regime. Edward was effectively validating Hitler's regime on the world stage at a critical time when the international community was desperately trying to isolate the dictator and prevent the slide into war. To Hitler, Edward was the perfect useful idiot, a man with a globally recognized face and a royal pedigree who could be used to bypass the British government and speak directly to the British people, convincing them that their true interests lay in a partnership with Germany rather than a conflict that would surely come. The Duke, in his immense vanity, believed he was saving the peace and acting as a grand statesman. In reality, he was emboldening a monster and providing him with the psychological tools to weaken British resolve. The propaganda value of the Windsor visit to Germany was immeasurable, and the Nazi machine knew exactly how to extract every drop of benefit from it. Joseph Goebbels, the masterful and ruthless Nazi minister of propaganda, weaponizes the visit with surgical precision, broadcasting the images and film footage globally to show that the British royalty, or at least its most famous and beloved member, supports the Nazi cause. The photos of the Duke laughing with Hitler, the Duchess smiling at Goebbels, and the Duke's arm raised in the Nazi salute were printed in newspapers across the globe and shown in newsreels from Berlin to Buenos Aires. These images served as a powerful tool to demoralize those who opposed fascism, suggesting that even the heart of the British Empire was sympathetic to the Nazi movement. The headlines in the German papers, like the Völkischer Beobachter, proclaimed the Duke as a friend of the German people. Back in London, the royal family and the government were horrified, realizing with a sense of dread that Edward was no longer just a black sheep to be managed with a small pension and distant letters. He had become a potent and active propaganda tool for the enemy. King George VI, already struggling with the immense psychological pressure of his new role, his speech impediment, and the looming threat of war, felt a deep, gut-wrenching sense of personal and familial betrayal. Winston Churchill, who was then still a lonely voice in the wilderness of British politics, but a vocal critic of the policy of appeasement, saw the Duke's actions as a direct and immediate threat to the morale and security of the British Isles. The line between royal eccentricity and active, dangerous collaboration had been crossed, and there was no going back. The images of the visit remained in the minds of many in the British establishment, making them realize that if war came, the Duke of Windsor could not be trusted. When the Second World War finally breaks out in September 1939, the situation with the Duke of Windsor turns from a public relations nightmare into a potential military and intelligence catastrophe of the first magnitude. Despite his history of pro-German sentiment, the Duke is brought back into the fold and stationed in France as a major general, ostensibly to serve as a high-level liaison officer between the British and French commands. However, his presence on the front lines was anything but helpful. Throughout the phony war and the subsequent invasion of France, his defeatist attitude was pervasive and dangerous, spreading through the ranks of the officers he interacted with like a contagion. He frequently and openly expressed his belief that Britain could not win the war, that the French were doomed, and that the entire conflict was a pointless waste of British life that could be settled with a quick negotiation. He even visited the Maginot Line, where he was reportedly critical of the French military strategy, while at the same time being seen as a person who could not be trusted with the details of that very strategy. More alarmingly, the Duke is suspected by modern historians and contemporary intelligence officers of leaking Allied war plans to the Germans through his social connections in neutral countries, like Spain and Switzerland. Intelligence reports from the time, including those from the French intelligence services, suggested that the Duke was being fatally indiscreet about the placement of Allied defenses, and the low morale of the French army believing that a quick British surrender would bring about an immediate peace and perhaps restore him to a position of importance in a new German-led European order. He seemed to view the war not as an existential struggle for survival against a genocidal tyranny, but as an inconvenient obstacle to his own personal return to relevance. His presence on the front lines became such an unbearable liability that the French High Command, led by General Gamelin, and the British General Staff eventually began to treat him as a person of extreme suspicion, rather than a senior officer, often withholding sensitive information from him entirely to prevent it from reaching Berlin. The danger to the British crown and the survival of the nation reached its absolute zenith. After the fall of France in the summer of 1940, the Windsors fled the advancing German armies in a frantic car journey across France, eventually ending up in neutral Portugal, which was at the time a hotbed of international espionage, refugees, and Nazi agents. It was here, in the sun-drenched villas of Estoril and Lisbon, that they became the center of a sinister Nazi plot known as Operation Willy. Walter Schellenberg, a top Nazi spy and the head of foreign intelligence for the SS, was personally dispatched by Ribbentrop and Hitler to Lisbon with a singular and dangerous mission. His task was to kidnap or, if possible, coerce Edward into returning to Spanish territory, which was under the control of the pro-Axis General Franco, where he could be held as a king-in-waiting. The Nazis promised him that once Germany successfully invaded and occupied England, a plan known as Operation Sea Lion, they would restore him to the British throne as a puppet king, replacing his brother George VI. The plan was incredibly elaborate, involving the Duke of Braganza and the Marques d'Estella as intermediaries. It featured staged threats against the Duke's life, such as reports of British assassins or explosives planted in his luggage, that the Nazis would then save him from, thereby winning his gratitude and securing his loyalty. They also promised him a massive fortune of 50 million Swiss francs, to be held in a secure bank account in his name. Edward, stuck in a villa in Lisbon and feeling bitter, neglected, and abandoned by his family in London, dangerously flirted with the idea. He delayed his departure to his new, government-assigned post in the Bahamas for weeks, sending telegrams back to London that suggested he was waiting for a turning point in the war. He was effectively negotiating his price and his conditions while his country faced the very real and imminent threat of a Nazi invasion. The prospect of King Edward VIII returning to a conquered London, under the direct protection of the Wehrmacht, was the ultimate, terrifying nightmare for Winston Churchill and the British government. Winston Churchill, now the Prime Minister and fully aware of the catastrophic danger through decrypted enigma, intercepts and urgent reports from British intelligence in Lisbon, realized he had to act with brutal and absolute decisiveness to prevent a total collapse of national morale and the loss of the former king to the enemy. He issues a chilling and unambiguous ultimatum. Edward must board a ship and take up a governorship in the remote, strategically insignificant Bahamas immediately, or face a full court-martial. Churchill's telegrams to the Duke during this period were uncharacteristically blunt. Stripped of the usual flowery royal pleasantries and traditional deference, he made it perfectly clear that the Duke was a serving officer in the British Army, and that his refusal to obey orders in a time of national emergency would be treated as desertion in the face of the enemy, a crime that, in wartime, was punishable by death. The Duke, realizing that his room for political maneuver had completely vanished, and that Churchill, unlike his predecessor, was not a man to be trifled with, finally relented. He and the Duchess boarded the American ship Excalibur, headed for the Caribbean. The Duke and Duchess are effectively shipped off to the other side of the world, a gilded exile in a colonial backwater where they could do the least amount of damage to the war effort. The Duchess was particularly bitter, famously referring to the Bahamas as the Elba of 1940, a reference to Napoleon's place of exile. For the remainder of the war, the Windsors were kept under constant and close surveillance in Nassau by both the British and the Americans, far away from the European theater, where their presence could be exploited by the Axis powers for propaganda or political leverage. They spent their time complaining about the climate, the lack of society, and their perceived mistreatment by the men in London. They were, for all intents and purposes, prisoners of the state, albeit in a tropical paradise. Even after the guns fell silent in 1945 and the Nazi regime was dismantled, the ghosts of Edward's wartime treason refused to stay buried in the ruins of the Reich. In the final chaotic months of the war, as Allied forces swept through the German countryside and captured high-ranking officials, a group of American soldiers from the 474th Counterintelligence Corps discovered a massive cache of documents hidden in Schloss Marburg. These would become known to history as the Marburg Files or the Windsor Files. These documents were a gold mine of captured German diplomatic records, containing high-level telegrams, meeting minutes, and personal correspondence between the Duke, his intermediaries, and top Nazi officials during the crucial years of 1940 and 1941. These documents reveal the true, shocking extent of his betrayal, including specific suggestions on how the Luftwaffe could bomb Britain into submission, more effectively to force a peace treaty. One of the most damning files suggested that the Duke believed that, if the Germans continued their heavy and indiscriminate bombing of London, the very city where his brother and niece, the future Elizabeth II, were staying, the British government would eventually be forced to sue for peace by a panicked and exhausted public, at which point he could be restored to the throne as the savior of the nation. The files also detailed his deep-seated hatred for his brother, King George VI, and his absolute willingness to serve as a mediator for Hitler to bring Britain into the Nazi fold. The evidence was undeniable and devastating. The former King of England had actively and consistently hoped for his own country's military defeat and the suffering of his former subjects if it served his personal ambitions for power and revenge. The Marburg Files stripped away the last vestiges of the romantic sacrifice myth, revealing a man who was prepared to rule over a Nazi colony. The discovery of the Marburg Files placed the British government and the royal family in an almost impossible and terrifying position. To protect the very survival of the monarchy in the fragile and exhausted post-war era, King George VI and Winston Churchill reached a secret agreement to suppress the files and keep them classified for as long as possible. They launched a massive, coordinated diplomatic and intelligence effort to convince the American and French governments, who also held copies of some of the documents, to keep the files out of the public eye for at least 20 years. They understood with chilling clarity that if the British public, who had just endured years of rationing, bombing, the loss of millions of lives, and the near destruction of their civilization, knew that their former king had been colluding with the enemy while London burned and their children were being killed in the Blitz, the House of Windsor would likely fall to a Republican revolution. The monarchy's legitimacy rested entirely on its status as a symbol of national unity, shared sacrifice, and the mantra of duty first. The revelation that the former head of that sacred institution was a Nazi sympathizer and a traitor would have been a terminal death blow to the crown. The files were locked away in the deepest vaults of the royal archives, and a carefully reinforced narrative of the abdication for love was pushed back into the public consciousness by historians like John Wheeler Bennett to ensure that the Duke of Windsor remained a romantic if tragic footnote in history rather than being remembered as a national villain. Even when historians began to push for their release in the 1950s, the Queen and her government fought a rearguard action to keep the most damning parts hidden. The survival of the crown was bought with a high price, the systematic suppression of the truth, and the protection of a man who had sought its downfall. Truth, however, is a persistent and undeniable force, and it has a way of eventually surfacing through the cracks of even the most fortified and guarded archives. The Marburg Files were eventually released to the public in full years later, primarily due to the persistence of independent historians, the gradual declassification of Allied war records, and a growing public demand for transparency in the late 20th century. Their publication cast a permanent, dark shadow over the Duke of Windsor's legacy that can never be fully erased, regardless of the romantic movies made about him. Today, Edward VIII is no longer seen through the nostalgic lens of a tragic star-crossed romance, but as a deeply flawed and dangerous cautionary tale of how vanity, resentment, and a total lack of a moral compass can lead even those at the highest levels of global power to betray their own people for personal gain. The narrative of the people's king has been replaced by the cold, hard reality of a man who was willing to be a puppet for a genocidal regime that stood for everything the British people were fighting against. The script concludes by reflecting on how Queen Elizabeth II had to navigate this treacherous and painful family history. Throughout her entire 70-year reign, she inherited a crown that had been nearly tarnished beyond repair by her uncle's actions, and she spent every single day of her life rebuilding the trust, the dignity, and the sense of duty that he had so recklessly shattered. Balancing her personal memories of her uncle with the objective, documented knowledge of his unforgivable treason, she chose the path he refused, a life of absolute, selfless duty, ensuring that the survival and the integrity of the monarchy would never again be threatened by the personal whims, the ego, or the dangerous ideologies of a single individual. She was the antidote to his poison. The long-guarded silence of the archives has finally been broken, and the legacy of the king, who would be a Nazi puppet, stands as a stark and sobering reminder of the fragile thin line between royal loyalty and the darkest forms of betrayal that history can produce.